What we're going to do in this video is talk about equilibrium in a macroeconomics context. And some of this will be review, but hopefully it connects a few more dots. So let me draw some axes here. This would be our price level for an economy. It could be some type of price index. And then this right over here, let's call that real GDP. Real GDP. And then I'm going to draw the aggregate demand curve that we have seen multiple times. And we have talked at length in other videos about why it would be, or why you could justify it being downward sloping like this. So this is our aggregate demand curve. And now let me draw a short run aggregate supply curve. So let's say this is our short run aggregate supply curve. Short run aggregate supply curve. I'll just call it short run aggregate supply curve 1. Now, where we intersect, we have an equilibrium point. And this can be specified, or it can specify. We have our short run equilibrium output right over here. So short run equilibrium output, and the corresponding equilibrium price level. And to feel good about this, actually would, if we assume what we have to assume to use this model, that this actually would be the price level in the economy and the output level for the economy. Let's imagine if we were at a different price level. What if we were at this price level right over here? At this price level, aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. And so we're going to have shortages. And what would happen in a shortage situation? Well, people who need the output say, well, I might be willing to pay a little bit more for it. But if you have to pay more for it, people might demand, or folks might demand less of it. And likewise, from a supplier point of view, if it's a shortage, they might say, hey, we might raise prices. There's a lot of demand for our output. But as prices go up, they'll also increase supply. And so you'll get back to the equilibrium point. Likewise, if for some reason our price level was above that equilibrium price level, let's say right over here, our aggregate supply, our short-run aggregate supply, outstrips our aggregate demand. And so you're going to have a glut of output. There's not enough demand for all of that output. And so you can imagine suppliers say, oh, well, maybe I'll lower the price on that output, and then maybe I'll produce a little bit less of it, and we'll move in this direction. And then on the demand side, people will say, hey, if you want me to use that output, you got to lower that price. And as the price comes down, hey, we'll use more and more of that output until you get back to this equilibrium point. Now, one interesting thing is to put this in context of the business cycle. And to appreciate that, we have to think about where the long-run aggregate demand is. And we've drawn this before. The long-run aggregate demand curve, I guess we could call it, it tends to be a vertical line, or we draw it with a vertical line. Let's say something like this. So this is our long-run aggregate demand. And this level of output, Y sub F, it has a little F subscript for full employment. You could kind of view this as the economic potential, given the people, the skills, the technology, the resources, the current state of that economy. And so you see clearly here that our short-run equilibrium output is below our full employment output. We have an output gap. You have this negative gap right over here. So one interesting question is to think about, well, how does this connect to the business cycle? So for example, let's try to do that. So my vertical axis, I'm going to make real GDP, and then I'm going to make my horizontal axis. This is the passage of time. And we know that a real economy is going to go through cycles. So it might go through something like that. Now, in theory, there is always some potential for that economy. So at full employment potential, at this point in time, it might be that. At this point in time, it might be that. At this point in time, it might be that. And so as the economy gets more people, more natural resources, better technologies, better ways to organize its economy, in theory, it could just keep growing in this very simple way. But we know economies don't do that. They cycle around it. And these times when the output is growing, we call these expansion. And the time when real output is shrinking, we call these recessions. The real output is receding. Recessions. So what I want you to do is look at this scenario that we just set up, where we have this short-run equilibrium output that is below the full employment output. Where could this correspond to on this business cycle? And let me write this down. This is the business cycle right over here. Business cycle, or sometimes the economic cycle. This could be a snapshot of what point in time over here? Well, our actual short-run equilibrium output is below our potential. So we're at one of these points that are below the blue line. So for example, we might be at this situation right over here, or maybe we are at this situation. We could be at any of these situations where our actual output is below the potential output, the full employment output for our economy. So for example, we might be exactly at this time right over here. Let's call that T1. And this right over here would be Y1. To have a scenario where we are above the curve, let's say something like this, well, something would have happened. These aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply curves would have to be in a different place. And in future videos, we'll talk more about how they shift. But you could imagine something like this, where this is short-run aggregate supply curve 2. And we'll talk in the future why these things might shift like that. But here you have a different equilibrium point. You have a different short-run equilibrium output, Y2, which is above the potential. And that can happen. This potential right here, this is what's sustainable for an economy. When we go above it, an economy can go beyond that, but that's not considered sustainable. People might not be sleeping properly, or you might be depleting resources in an unsustainable way. And in the future, we'll talk about how we will keep going back to the potential for the economy. Now, an interesting point is when this equilibrium point, when the short-run equilibrium coincides with the long-run aggregate demand. So you could have this scenario. Let me do it in yellow to make it stand out a little bit. So, and it's not always just the short-run aggregate supply curve that's moving, but I'm moving that around for simplicity. So let's say short-run aggregate supply curve 3. In this situation, our short-run equilibrium our short-run equilibrium output corresponds to our full employment output. So in this situation, Y3 is equal to Y sub F. And when we are in this situation, this is known as long-run equilibrium. And points that correspond to long-run equilibrium on this business cycle are when our actual output corresponds with the full employment output for that economy. So it could be at that point, it could be at that point, and it could be at that point. And so I will leave you there. In future videos, we will use this model right over here to explain how we can go from different points in this economic cycle to other points. And as I always say in every video, these are all simplifications of things that are super complex phenomena in the world, but they can be helpful frameworks for us to think about what is likely to happen in an economy given certain factors or certain events.